now too?
Sure. Hi, welcome. I'm Peggy McPhillips, president of Norfolk Historical Society, and I am delighted to welcome everybody to the February Lewis Sky History Program. We are very lucky to have tonight someone who is probably no stranger to you, Amanda Williams, who is the education director at MacArthur Memorial, and also is as acting co-director of the memorial. Amanda is a graduate of Randolph-Macon Women's College in Lynchburg, Virginia, where she majored in history and art history. She received a master's in history from Old Dominion University and started her career in historic Jamestown as an archaeologist. She came to the MacArthur Memorial in 2009 as education manager, and she's there today. She's developed some wonderful programs and podcasts. She's adapted very well to the days of COVID when we are doing so many things by podcast and webinar. So we're delighted to have her here tonight. She will bring us the story tonight of some of the prominent American military and political leaders of World War II. And she'll go back in time a little bit to tell how they, their careers and their leadership styles were shaped by their experiences and challenges during World War I, which served, as she says, as their crucible for their later career. The title is World War I and the Forging of America's World War II Leadership. I will tell you that during the program, if you have questions, you'll notice at the bottom of your screen, there's a chat feature or ask questions feature, and you can type your questions in there. I will keep track of them and we'll throw them all at Amanda at the end of the program. So any questions you have will be answered beautifully by Amanda at the end of the program. So I'll step away now and invite you all to sit back and enjoy the program.
Thank you, Peggy, and thank you everyone for having me tonight to share this PowerPoint. All right, so tonight I'm going to be talking, as Peggy said, about the World War I experiences of some of the major leaders that the United States had during World War II and how they kind of got a lot of their experience in World War I. Now, you can argue that World War I really set the fault lines of our world today. But I think people tend to forget some of the more human aspects of it and some of the more personal experiences that people had in that war that they then carried over into World War II. And I think people tend to also forget that a lot of the World War II leaders that we know so well, like Eisenhower, MacArthur, Marshall, and even people like President Truman, they're largely forged by that very important experience of World War I that they all have in their very kind of early days. Now, when we think about America's doughboys in World War I, we sometimes think of the young men that you see in photographs like this. They're frozen in time as relatively young men. And we forget that by and large, these are the men who are going to be the parents of the greatest generation. And they're going to be the leaders of the greatest generation because of kind of their age by the time World War II rolls around. And the men I'm going to talk about today are all Army officers in World War I. They all had vastly different experiences, but again, it's going to shape their vision of World War II. And I think in a lot of respects, it's going to shape the leadership that they provide. And again, we'll be talking about Eisenhower, MacArthur, Marshall, and then of course, President Truman. We'll start with a little trivia though. And I know this format doesn't really lend itself to that, but just think about it for a minute. Which US World War II leader was not a fan of the Marine Corps during World War I because he believed they got too much publicity? So just let you think about that for a minute. And the answer to that is future President Harry S. Truman. That's going to be kind of a bone of contention that he has during World War I. He's a little jealous of the Marines and their good publicity during that war. And another piece of trivia: which leader was the recipient of 2 Distinguished Service Crosses, 1 Distinguished Service Medal, 7 Silver Stars, later 2 Purple Hearts, and 2 Croix de Guerre? Let you think about it for a minute, and the answer to this is Douglas MacArthur. Plus, there'll be maybe a hint of a nomination for the Medal of Honor, maybe once or twice during the war. So he's somebody who clearly walks away from this conflict highly, highly decorated. And we'll talk more about that in a little while. So back to our story, we will start with Dwight D. Eisenhower. Now, Eisenhower, like many young officers, is very excited by the prospect of World War I. A 1915 graduate of West Point, he is a member of the class that the stars fell on. About 60 of his fellow graduates in that class will be general officers in World War II. That's why they have that nickname. And Eisenhower, like a lot of other young men in the Army at that time, feels that World War I could be it. This could be the last major war ever. And, if there's never another big one like this, and if he misses out, how will he ever succeed in the Army? How will he ever kind of be the leader that he wants to be? To his dismay, in 1917, when the United States gets involved in the war, he is not sent overseas. He's not even kind of put in a position where it looks like that might happen even in 6 months to a year. Instead, he is tasked with training a lot of the troops. He's initially going to be sent to Georgia to train some new officers. And then later on, he'll be sent to Fort Leavenworth to kind of supervise some more training, to work with new recruits to make sure that they're all ready to go overseas. But again, he's not being sent. I think very early on, the Army realizes that he just excels at logistics. He excels at training men and kind of getting them ready for what they need to go to in terms of overseas. And so he is just, he gets rewarded by, instead of in his mind being sent to go fight and experience combat the way he wants to, instead he's kind of continually rewarded by more training assignments, also more responsibility, but not necessarily the command that he wants to have in this war. February 1918, he's sent to Maryland. He is sent to a tank school, or actually to join a tank battalion. And he's very excited because he thinks this is probably going to be his ticket to France. Unfortunately, there aren't really any tanks for them to work with initially. And so it's kind of a bit of a bust for him. But around this time, the US Army actually creates an armor branch. And he is then sent to Gettysburg to run the Army's first tank school. Meanwhile, the unit that he was with in Maryland goes to France to fight. And so he's very kind of disappointed by that. But he goes to Gettysburg. And again, they don't have real tanks there for a long time. This kind of makes it very hard to run a tank school and even to keep up the morale of your men when you're all there to be learning about how to maneuver these tanks, how to use them in combat, and you really have nothing to train with. And so, as he's going to be technically in charge of this school. He's going to be writing the manuals for the Army on how to use tanks, how to kind of have a tank school in general. But he really lacks a lot of what he needs to be successful. By about mid-1918, there are probably over 11,000 men at Camp Colt at Gettysburg, where he is. He is promoted to lieutenant colonel, but he's really doing the job of a brigadier general. He just, in terms of organizing things, in terms of kind of just anything you can think of, he has just enormous responsibility there. And his job is basically to keep these 11,000 troops morale high, have them ready to deploy if that's what needs to happen, and to kind of keep them busy when sometimes they don't really have the equipment that they need to train properly. He's also going to deal with the Spanish flu during this time, and there is definitely an outbreak that takes place at Camp Colt, and he's credited later on by the Army with handling that pandemic very, very well, and making sure that there's proper medical care and proper quarantines. And he really kind of prevents this disease from kind of spiraling out of control at Camp Colt. I think there'll be something like 130 or so soldiers will die. But for the most part, the most of the 11,000 are okay. So he's actually very successful in managing not just the Spanish flu, but again, the men under his command. He basically builds the Army's first tank school from nothing. And people, I think, would be very interested to know that when he's actually at Camp Colt, when they do get some tanks, they will be practicing with these things where Pickett's charge took place. Battlefield preservation was not what we think of it as today. Back in 1918, they had these tanks all over that battlefield. And so that was, I think that's very interesting to think about today. Now, then towards the end of the war, so about November 1918, there's a moment of elation for him. After all of his hard work, after all of his training and sending other people to fight, he gets orders that he's to depart Gettysburg to command an armored regiment in the upcoming spring 1919 offensive. And he's ordered to depart Gettysburg on November 10th, 1918. So he's getting ready for that. And then within 24 hours of receiving that order, it becomes very clear that an armistice is coming. And that armistice will come November 11, 1918. He is absolutely devastated. I think he feels like he has missed his war. He's missed his chance. And that's going to be something that he thinks about for quite a while in this early part of his career. And those were those orders that he had. Now, years later, detractors will point out that he never serves in combat, that he never leads troops in combat. Now, many of the Allied leaders and some of his fellow American commanders in World War II will sometimes feel superior to him because they've seen combat firsthand and he hasn't necessarily. His biographers, though, tend to play it off as a strength. They point out that unlike some World War I veterans, some of his contemporaries, in World War II, he can move aggressively because he hasn't been paralyzed by memories of excessive slaughter or fear from World War I. He's prepared to lead a war of movement, not necessarily wage a defensive static struggle, and they tend to liken him to Grant in the American Civil War. He's somebody who is willing to take risks, and he's someone who's willing to sacrifice for victory. And there are certain moments in World War II, especially when you think about the landings at Normandy, where he's making some incredibly difficult decisions that could have gone, another way. But he has this kind of courage and this willingness to take these risks that a lot of his biographers say he might not have had he had a more traumatic experience in World War I. So something kind of interesting to think about in terms of him. So some of the lessons that he takes away from World War I is that logistics are obviously very important. He learns quite a bit at Camp Colt how to keep camp supplied, how to make sure that troops going off into combat have the equipment that they need, have the training that they need. When you look at the logistics for D-Day in World War II, it's absolutely unprecedented. And, he's obviously not doing every tiny little piece of that, but he understands the process and he understands how to scale a much smaller kind of thing to a much larger. And so I think his ability to do that and to understand logistics gives US troops in World War II that are doing the landing at Normandy an extraordinary advantage in terms of supplies. And they'll carry this with them through the war, I think, all the way to Germany. He also, I think, learns that careful planning is really never wasted. plans fall apart. And if you've done your homework, you have some alternatives. And I think he also learns that you have to play to people's strengths. You have to figure out who is good at what. And if someone isn't capable of a particular job, you have to move them along and you have to get someone else in there who can do that job. And he, I think, like George Marshall, has an incredible talent for finding men who are very good at something and putting them in the right job where they fit best. And then removing people who are not helpful, who are not advancing the mission. They have very kind of clear idea of the talent that they want and who is best to do that. I think he also works a lot with National Guard troops in World War I. I think he develops a respect for citizen soldiers in a way that a lot of regular Army officers didn't in World War I. I think he also understands what motivates people who are drafted and what motivates members of the National Guard and what doesn't. And he's never going to be tone deaf in his communiques to his troops in World War II. And, I think something else that's often overlooked is in World War I think he learns to deal with disappointment in private. So if he's frustrated about something career-wise, if he's frustrated about maybe a situation occurring in World War II, he understands how to manage that, how to do that in private, to hide his irritation and to get the job done. And they think this really helps him with coalition warfare in World War II because he's dealing with a lot of personalities. He's dealing with a lot of different countries. And his job is to be kind of a diplomat, but also this commander in chief. And I think his ability to, again, deal with frustration on any level is pretty important. And I think he really kind of learns that in World War I because he has to deal with that frustration of not having been in combat, not having his kind of main career dreams come true very quickly. And he just, it's a good lesson for him by the time World War II rolls around and he is this top commander. All right, moving on to Douglas MacArthur. He graduates top in his class from West Point in 1903. And again, he's another young officer, fairly interested and excited about World War I. Like a lot of other officers like Eisenhower, he's thinking that this could be the last big one and it's a career maker. I think he always wanted to be president of the United States. He grows up with a very serious belief that to be president of the United States, that you have to have fought in the war that defines your generation. And you have to not just, be in uniform. You can't sit behind a desk and do that. You have to fight from the front. You have to prove your fitness as commander in chief by leading men in combat. And so I think, his father is also the recipient or was the recipient of the Medal of Honor for actions during the American Civil War. And I think in the back of his mind, he's also thinking that, this could be his war to receive the Medal of Honor. He wants to equal, if not surpass, his father's career. So there's a lot of ambition in terms of MacArthur going into World War I. And really from the moment the United States enters the war, he's really doing everything he can to see combat and lobbying to kind of make this happen. At the time the war starts, he is a major. He is basically the Army's first public affairs officer. But he's going to lobby his way onto the 42nd Rainbow Division as its chief of staff, and he'll end up going to France with the 42nd Division. In France, he pretty much gets into a little bit of conflict with Pershing really from the start. Pershing had been a longtime family friend, and MacArthur just kind of butts heads with him a little bit. And, the problem is Pershing is obviously the commander of the AEF and MacArthur is a colonel, chief of staff of the 42nd Division. So it's kind of somebody that he doesn't really need to be tangling with. MacArthur is going to meet Patton during this war. And during the war, at this point, this is about right around the time of the San Miguel offensive, MacArthur by this point is a brigadier general and Patton is a lieutenant colonel. And MacArthur's going to be in command of the 84th Brigade of the 42nd Division, and Patton's in command of the 327th Tank Battalion. And right around one of these little villages in France during the Saint Mihiel offensive, Patton sees MacArthur standing on a small hill and walks up to talk to him. They're both West Point graduates, but they, hadn't really met before. And so Patton just goes up the hill to kind of talk to him. And while they're up there, there's this barrage that starts moving towards their position. And everybody else is going for cover. And both of them decide to stay where they are. And so they just stay talking on top of this hill, refusing to go for cover, kind of waiting for the other guy to do it first. They're kind of playing chicken with each other. Fortunately, both men survive. And about 4 days after this meeting, Patton writes to his wife, "I was the only man on the front line except for General MacArthur who never ducked a shell." And he lets his wife know that he thinks MacArthur is this very, very brave officer, like himself. They're they're kind of similar in that regard. It's kind of interesting. MacArthur makes absolutely no mention of meeting Patton or this incident in his own writings, but Patton has it in a letter to his wife 4 days after it happens. These are two men who obviously are very famous. They're famous for being these kind of very flamboyant leaders in some ways, and they're both incredibly brave men. Unfortunately, probably in the case of both of them, they're going to be some of the few that look at Eisenhower and respect him quite a bit for his many, many abilities. But I think sometimes at the end of the day, these two officers in particular see Eisenhower as someone who, having not seen combat, lacks a little something that they both have. And that I think will be a little problematic for all of them in the future and going forward into World War II. Now, MacArthur, as I said, was a brigadier general in World War I. He essentially goes from major to brigadier general in less than a year and a half, and he gets to actually keep this wartime promotion after the war. Most other young officers we've already talked about tonight, Marshall, Eisenhower, Patton, or we will be talking about, they do get these great wartime promotions. And then the war ends and they kind of go back to revert to their original rank in the regular army. And then they pretty much are waiting till World War II rolls around to kind of climb back up the ranks. And not MacArthur. In fact, he's really in line to be promoted to major general when the war ends and freezes all promotions. Again, he's going to be nominated for the Medal of Honor at least once during this war. But I think a lot of these nominations are kind of downgraded. And there's also this sense at Pershing's headquarters that obviously MacArthur's not a favorite of Pershing, but there's also a sense that the Medal of Honor is not for general officers at this moment. And so that's going to kind of, I think, derail his Medal of Honor quest. Towards the end of the war, something that a lot of people don't know, he's also briefly arrested by members of the 1st Division during the drive towards Sedan. George Marshall, who had been working at Pershing's headquarters and is really kind of the architect of the kind of final Allied drive at that moment, he tells the 1st Division, his old division, to ignore the boundaries between all of the divisions trying to rush towards Germany and to just go forward as fast as possible. In the process, the 1st Division crosses in front of MacArthur's 42nd Division, and MacArthur hears about it, and he kind of goes out to the front to try to kind of talk to them and order them out of the path of his division. He is known for his non-regulation attire, and some of the troops in the 1st Division mistake him for a German general, and they arrest him. He's later let out. He says that there's no hard feelings, and there apparently there really wasn't. But I think by the time World War II and Korea roll around, I think he starts blaming Marshall for some things and seeing Marshall as someone who has kind of stabbed him in the back at various points in his career, whether that's warranted or not. Now, when it comes to MacArthur's efficiency reports, at the very end of the war, General Pershing fills this out, and he basically says that MacArthur is America's most capable battlefield commander, and that his personal leadership and genius accounted for American successes at very important turning points on the battlefield during the war. There's no doubt that MacArthur was incredibly brave. Anybody who refers to him as Dugout Doug needs to read a history book. He was incredibly brave. He was incredibly efficient and proficient as an officer. He spends most of his time in World War I kind of at the front, kind of leading his troops very, very close to where the action is. And Pershing recognizes that. I think, in Pershing's mind, George Marshall is his greatest kind of staff officer. Douglas MacArthur is his greatest battlefield commander. But Pershing also qualifies this report and says that MacArthur also has a high estimate of his own abilities. It's not an unwarranted estimate of his own abilities. It's just something that makes him somewhat difficult to work with at times. This is the MacArthur that most people know. This is MacArthur during World War II. Again, he's going to be called Dugout Doug by a lot of his detractors. And as you can imagine, I think he was deeply wounded by that nickname. I don't think any of his troops in World War I would have agreed with that. And he certainly wasn't a coward. But that's just the unfortunate nickname that he received from some people during the war. So what does he bring to World War II? From a young man who had been relatively excited to be a part of a conflict, who really wanted to get a Medal of Honor, who thought that war was glory, he learns, I think, very quickly in France, within days of actually seeing actual combat, that war is absolutely terrible, that it's a scourge. He talks about in his biography just his first little experiences of combat. He forgets how to play, that the rest of his life is very different after that. I think he also learns about knowing and choosing your battlefield. I think he's at his most successful when he does that. In Korea, when he's flying over battlefields and not as perhaps engaged with the terrain and things like that, I think he has more problems. But in World War I, he has this incredible ability to know and choose the battlefield. He's also somebody who for his entire life is going to be interested in technology. Now, I think as some things in early World War II show, he may be a fan of technology. He may be a fan of things like, aviation, air power, and see how important it is. It doesn't necessarily mean he always knows how to use it. But I think what's important is that from the time of World War I on, he's interested in learning, lifelong learning, and technology for him is a part of that. He is not somebody who's afraid of this stuff. And I think that's where we get this general who's in his 60s in World War II, who can, is thinking about how you do these joint operations, how you combine air, land, and sea to move forward. And so he's not afraid of these things. He's interested in learning more always. He also, I think, learns in World War I that winning the peace is just as important as winning the war. He's very disillusioned with the Treaty of Versailles. He writes a letter home saying that, this treaty is a treaty of perpetual war, not a treaty of perpetual peace. And we're going to be back here in another couple decades doing this all over again. And so, he has this just incredible sense that the job is not done after the military victory. You have to win the peace afterwards, or it was a terrible, terrible, costly waste for everyone. Some negative things, though, that I think he learns, and I kind of touched on this when I told you the story about Marshall, is that he believes that there are people that are jealous of him, whether it's people who are part of General Pershing's Chaumont headquarters, whether it's politicians, rivals who can be just as dangerous to you as the enemy. And I think throughout his career, he's kind of always looking over his shoulder, kind of trying to identify, these people and how they may impact his career negatively. And I think that's kind of a very negative lesson that he learns, but in some instances, not necessarily untrue. And again, as I mentioned when I told you the story about him and Patton, I think sometimes he does have a bit of a sense that the true soldiers are the ones with combat experience. Again, he respects men like Marshall and Truman for their kind of organizational abilities, their leadership abilities. But I think there's always kind of that little tiny kernel of a feeling that I might be the more complete soldier. And that is something that I think can be a little problematic. But it's just something that he might have felt. All right, so George Marshall. Now, he's not a West Point man. He's a graduate of VMI, and he is a U.S. Army captain when the war begins. He will initially serve with the 1st Division, and he's actually going to get to France before everybody else that I had talked about already. And he's going to play a very, very big role in keeping the 1st Division's headquarters informed about the frontline situation that the 1st Division is encountering. He's basically the eyes and ears, but he's not leading men in combat, but he's there, he's seeing everything, and he's kind of, being this these eyes and ears of headquarters. Now, like MacArthur, he kind of gets to France and has a bit of a disagreement with Pershing. During a demonstration by the 1st Division that kind of goes wrong, Pershing launches into a blistering tirade about, this division is awful, this is garbage. And Marshall, who's been working so hard to try to make this right, and the other staff officers are all there listening to it. And Marshall just decides he can't stand by and let Pershing say this stuff. And he actually follows Pershing when Pershing starts walking away. And he argues with him, and he basically says he's judging the 1st Division without understanding the challenges that they're facing. And Pershing basically tells him, okay, well, now you understand all of my problems and what I face every day. And Marshall says, yes, I appreciate the fact that you have this enormous responsibility and you're dealing with challenges on a scale that we're not, but we have to solve these divisional problems every day by night. We have to keep this thing moving. We have to take care of these men. Ours is sometimes maybe a little more time sensitive. It's very serious. Now, his fellow officers witness this, and they figure that it's basically the end of Marshall's career. But it's not. There's no punishment. Meanwhile, the war continues. The 1st Division loses a lot of its officers in combat. Marshall is thinking at this point that this will mean that instead of being at headquarters, he'll be able to kind of have the opportunity for a combat command. Instead, while he's kind of waiting for the orders to kind of go to the front, he's called up to Pershing's headquarters. Pershing remembers this officer. People think very, very highly of Marshall, and Pershing just decides, I need this guy on my staff. And so instead of getting this combat assignment, he goes to the AEF's main headquarters. He's soon wining and dining dignitaries and high-ranking Allied officers as part of his job as a staff officer. From Pershing's headquarters, he has a bird's eye view of the war, but he'd really rather be in combat. And yet his time in Pershing's headquarters really brings out his brilliance. It also allows him to observe Pershing up close and watch as Pershing responds to events on the ground. In the last 100 days of the war, it's Marshall planning for the AEF, not Pershing. It's Marshall figuring out Saint Mihiel and the Meuse-Argonne. He's the one writing orders to American divisions. And again, this is why MacArthur kind of blames him for some of that confusion in kind of the final days of the war. But I mean, he's literally this chess player organizing what the AEF is doing. And Pershing really understands that he's very talented at this, and kind of sets him up in this way. Again, literally running the war in World War I. That's interesting because in World War II, he literally runs the war again, just a couple decades later. Winston Churchill says that Marshall doesn't just run the war for the United States or for the army, he runs it for the Allies. He had that much respect for Marshall's ability to kind of see the big picture and to be that chess player. So what did he learn in World War I? Well, he learns a lot about working with allies. He learns very, very early on from a French officer that blood is an adhesive. This is kind of a quote from that French officer, and the officer was basically explaining to him that sometimes you have to bleed a bit for your allies for them to understand that you're serious and a committed partner. And Marshall will, I think, always kind of keep that in the back of his mind that as allies, we have to sacrifice for each other at times. And he becomes a very excellent diplomat, quite a peacemaker. Probably even more so than Eisenhower. But I think he has kind of a different kind of VIP level of making that happen. He's also somebody who can be very flexible. He's kind of not locked into any one idea or any one plan. He's very kind of pragmatic about his decisions and doesn't tend to take things personally. Very much a fan of military preparedness. He's going to be very, very kind of big on that. He's also going to be somebody who thinks that troop morale is a very tangible factor in any operation. And he's going to always be very concerned about that. And that is something that needs to be considered by commanders as they're planning some of these major events for World War II. And again, as I said, at Pershing's headquarters, he's literally running this war. By the end of it, I think he learns how to be an architect of victory on the battlefield, and how to kind of bring about a successful conclusion to the war. I think in World War II, obviously he's looking at this entire theater, keeping an eye on it. When it comes to MacArthur's Southwest Pacific area, I think he really kind of lets MacArthur do a lot of that. But he's still paying attention to it. He's still considering how that puzzle piece fits into the other broader picture. But he's certainly somebody who's, again, playing chess at a level that a lot of other guys aren't. Harry S. Truman. Now, Truman wanted to go to West Point, but he had very poor eyesight, and that pretty much disqualified him. When World War I came around, he memorized the eye test chart so that he could pass the test to get into the Missouri National Guard. And he entered as an enlisted man, but then was elected an officer by his fellow guardsmen. And when his unit was then called up and made part of the 35th Division and sent over to France, one of the first things that he noticed as a young Protestant who had been used to being surrounded by other Protestants and Midwesterners was how different the men of the 35th were. For the first time in his life, he's surrounded by people of kind of different faiths, of different backgrounds, and people who are not necessarily Midwesterners. And he later credits the U.S. Army with teaching him how to work with different types of people, of kind of creating this crucible where these differences kind of had to melt away. And it's one of the first things he notices about his service in the 35th Division, and it's something he remembers for the rest of his life. He is promoted to captain in 1918. He leads an artillery battalion in France, and he's really not very popular at first. His unit, when he kind of takes command of it, is pretty unruly. They're pretty out of control, but he will gradually earn their respect. He enforces discipline. He doesn't kind of shy away from that, and he does kind of earn their respect by the time they're in combat. And during the Meuse-Argonne, he is ordered to fire his guns in one direction, but he sees a German artillery unit preparing to fire on the 28th Division, and he actually moves his guns to fire on them. This act actually saves the lives of many men in the 28th Division, but it almost gets him court-martialed because according to his battle plan, he had been told to fire over here, and he responds to the situation he sees happening, and it's different than what he'd been ordered to do. So he's almost court-martialed, but again, he kind of, in the end, because of what happens, he's not. So he will see a lot of fighting in the war, not close and personal like MacArthur. MacArthur saw a little bit of hand-to-hand fighting, trench warfare, but Truman will see battlefields and he'll see men die. And he'll have kind of a very position of great responsibility and great strain for most of the last year of the war. What he doesn't do in the war is he doesn't almost kill Douglas MacArthur. A lot of people always say the reason that they have kind of a personal conflict, professional conflict, is that, he's this artillery officer who accidentally drops a shell on the 42nd Division and almost kills MacArthur, and MacArthur decides, you're a rotten officer, I'm gonna hate you forever. He doesn't do that. He's never within range to be able to do something like that. If you look at kind of where their units are day to day, this is not something that could have happened. And if it had happened, these guys would have been talking about it, especially after Korea, after Truman's not president and MacArthur's kind of, living in the Waldorf, and they're giving interviews to different reporters. They would have said something. But, if you just look at the day to day where their units are, this is not something that happened. But it makes for a nice myth for a lot of people that want to understand why these two men kind of had some conflict with each other later. However, he does develop in this war a well-developed dislike for people he feels are self-promoters and for organizations that have a better propaganda arm than he does. Now, I'm not talking about MacArthur in this war, but early on in the trivia question, we talked about him being kind of a little irritated with the Marine Corps because they had such good kind of, PR at the time. He walks away from this war, I think, with a sense that, there's some officers that are really good at self-promotion. There are some units and branches of the service that are better at this than others. Me and a lot of the guys I fought with, we fought just as hard as these guys, but we're not getting the limelight. And so I think he develops this thing going forward where he always kind of has this kind of visceral dislike of people who he sees as those self-promoters or those organizations that are good at that. And obviously that will certainly lead to conflict with MacArthur later on, because he's going to see MacArthur by World War II and Korea as somebody who's, kind of really good with that kind of PR arm. So decades later, he's president of the United States, president towards the end of World War II, and he has some very, very hard decisions to make. It's not just simply how do we end this war. He's having to make the decision about things like the atomic bomb and the occupations that will follow, and how the peace will be won, which is just as difficult as the battlefield. What does he take away from World War I think leadership. He had never held a position of leadership before World War I. And I think in this role, especially because he's not initially very popular, it doesn't come easy for him. And I think he learns that you can't duck the difficulties. And he'll be, kind of later famous for, you can't pass the buck sort of statement. But I think he also learns that as a leader, you can't really have regrets. If you've made this decision and it's the best decision you can make, you're going to have people that are unhappy with you. You're going to have people that feel like you didn't make the right decision, but you can't have regrets about that. You have to be able to make difficult decisions and move forward, and that's your job. It's not your job to pass off the hard decision to other people. And I think he really begins to learn that in World War I. And the idea that, people are going to hate you, and they're just going to hate you. It doesn't matter. You've got to make these decisions kind of independent of your fear of how people are going to feel about you. And I think it takes a lot of courage to do something like that. And I think that he begins to really learn that in World War I, that leadership is hard and you're not going to make everybody happy. He also, during this time, developed some interesting interpersonal skills, the skills that every politician needs, and really a knowledge of the diversity of U.S. citizens. We talked about him, being surprised in the division that he enters. There's Catholics. There are, people of kind of different ethnic backgrounds. Not everybody is a white Protestant Midwesterner. And he, it's a bit of culture shock for him, but for the rest of his life and as a politician, he understands the diverse fabric of not only our citizen soldiers and our armies, but of the country. And I think that's something that he kind of takes with him for the rest of his career. Now, before we close, I want to just talk about a few what ifs. Now, his historians, we don't always like to talk about what ifs because, we have enough with real history, but these are kind of interesting what ifs, I think. The first is Billy Mitchell. He's an Army officer in World War I. He leads about 1,500 Allied aircraft at San Miel. It's the first coordinated use of aircraft with ground forces in warfare. He's promoted to Brigadier General, and he commands all U.S. air units by the end of World War I. He remains an advocate of air power in the interwar years. He becomes very controversial and is disliked by some of his superiors because he essentially accuses them of treason for not prioritizing the development of American air power in that interwar year period. He will be court-martialed. It ends his military career. Douglas MacArthur is a part of that court-martial and later says it's one of the most distasteful things that he's ever involved in. But Mitchell, he dies in 1936, very frustrated and knowing that the Japanese and Germans are probably a little ahead of us in terms of this idea of how valuable air power is, and probably prepping for a future war that we will likely be caught flat-footed. Had he lived, I think World War II might have been a little different. It's a fascinating what if. What would have happened if Billy Mitchell's ideas had been accepted, not just by the Navy, but by the Army? What if America had had a more developed sense of what to do with air power and how to use it offensively and defensively? Would Pearl Harbor have happened in the way it happened? Would the Japanese have attempted it? Would we have been the first to figure out this idea of, these carrier fleets? Would air power have played an earlier, more decisive role in the Pacific? Again, it's a what if, it's a fascinating what if, but this is somebody who had some incredible lessons from World War I that we didn't get to see fully mature in World War II. And then Arthur MacArthur III. This is the older brother of Douglas MacArthur. He was a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy. He had experience with sail, steam, oil, subs, naval aviation, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, he just had this very kind of broad career. World War I, he serves on convoy duty and is awarded the Navy Cross. He is a captain in the early 1920s, and most people believe that he is kind of on his way to becoming an admiral and to becoming one of the leaders of the Navy. Unfortunately, he dies rather suddenly in 1923 of appendicitis, and it kind of ends his career right there. Again, a lot of people thought he was on his way to becoming a flag officer and probably chief of naval operations. Now, he might have been retired, probably retired by 1941, but there has been speculation that as talented as he was and as adaptive as he was to new technologies, like his younger brother, Douglas MacArthur, he might have still been in service, or he might have been brought back into service like his brother was. You look at the ages of a lot of the top leaders of the Navy and Army during World War II, a lot of them are past retirement age, technically, when they're involved in that conflict. So it's not inconceivable that Arthur MacArthur might still have been in service in World War II. And so the interesting what if is that, can you imagine a MacArthur as Chief of Naval Operations in World War II? and a Douglas MacArthur in the Pacific. What would joint operations between the Army and Navy have looked like in that theater? Would they have come together earlier in the war? Would the Europe first strategy been kind of jettisoned in favor of maybe a 50-50 strategy or a Pacific first strategy? And would someone like Douglas MacArthur have had a different relationship with the Navy if his brother was basically in charge of it? So again, some interesting kind of what ifs. Can't dwell on them too much, but they are very kind of interesting to think about a little bit. Now, we've talked about 4 main American World War II leaders who learned a lot in World War I. And we don't have time to talk about these men tonight, but it's important to remember that the same was pretty much true for the Allied and the Axis leaders in World War II. Pretty much everybody you see kind of leading these countries during this conflict, they all are basically born out of what happened in World War I, whether it's their perception of what they want to do with their country, whether it's their military objectives. They all have this experience of World War I that molds them and kind of does the same thing that it does to the American leaders. Everybody always talks about World War I creating the conditions that lead to World War II. No argument there. It certainly sets the stage for the next conflict. But as I hope you've seen, it was also a crucible that created some of our solutions for that problem. It created the men who would play a big role in defeating those Axis powers. So thank you very much for again having me tonight. And if there's any questions, happy to take those.
Amanda, thank you so much. I think it's a good reminder that things don't just spring fully formed. And they actually, the background of these men and the training that they had and their experiences, definitely very important. So thank you.
You're very welcome.
I'm not seeing any questions, but anybody? No. I love the part about MacArthur being arrested. That was amazing.
Very briefly.
Good that they didn't shoot him. Well, thank you so much. I will let all of you know that we will be, we have recorded this session tonight and we will have it in the next couple of days on the Norfolk Historical Society website, which is www.norfolkhistorical.org. So you will be able to watch it again, refer people who missed it tonight so that they can watch it. And we will see you all again in 4 weeks on March 9th for our next program. And Amanda, thank you again. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Bye-bye.